Have you heard of the strange things? I suppose the more pertinent question would be, have the strange things heard of you? They've certainly heard of Margaret, poor unfortunate Margaret. Once upon a time, young Margaret made her way to the local cemetery on her bicycle, a trip she made every month to visit the grave of her recently departed cousin Timothy. They'd been round about the same age, you see. They did everything together up until his untimely demise. On this occasion Margaret brought a bunch of flowers with her, to leave by Timothy's grave. She did this often. She usually visited him in the evenings to avoid the foot traffic and funerals that littered the daytime. She didn't find graveyards spooky in the slightest. In fact, for her, the scariest part of the trip was passing by the local duck pond. On this occasion she was harassed by a particularly gruesome-looking duck. It pecked away at her ankles as she went by, expecting her to deliver some bread, no doubt, as passers-by often did. She cursed the duck and made her way to the grave, as usual. She sat down beside Timothy's grave. It was a sunny day, for now. She laid the flowers beside his grave, a small grave appropriately sized for a small boy. She uttered a silent prayer. A single tear began to run down her cheek. It dripped onto the floor, onto the earth, and soon it was joined as the heavens opened and it began to rain. She cursed her luck. Margaret had been handing out a lot of curses today. The weather, the duck. Where would it all end, she thought. As she often did, she sat down and began to reminisce about the good old days, when her and Timothy would go out for bicycle rides in the country. Such good times they had together. As she came across a particularly fond memory in her mind, she saw a flock of ducks nearby. It angered her greatly. She was not fond of ducks at all, but she was fond of Timothy, her recently departed cousin, poor little Timothy. And in that moment of weakness, she uttered something that perhaps she shouldn't have done. The words that came out of her mouth were as follows.
"O Lord, why did you take Timothy from me at such a tender young age? I would gladly trade the life of every duck in the world, if only I could have my precious cousin Timothy back."
Thunder began to echo throughout the sky. Margaret didn't see any particular significance in this. It had been raining, after all. Perhaps it was merely coincidence. Perhaps it was. As she made her way home on her bicycle, she noticed that no ducks were there to harass her. Not a single one. Again, she put it down to sheer coincidence. Perhaps the ducks had been scared away by the weather conditions. That seemed very, very likely. Almost too likely, she thought. But she thought nothing more of it, and she made her way home on her bicycle. As she entered her home, she pushed open the door, walked into the kitchen. Sitting at the dinner table, she saw something she did not expect. Cousin Timothy, alive and well, eating a slice of bread dipped in soup. Seemed nothing was wrong with him. Although she had attended his funeral, she had visited his grave on numerous occasions. Something was amiss. She didn't know whether to rush up and give him a hug, or whether to run away in sheer terror. In the end she did neither, and she stood, frozen, staring at her cousin Timothy across the kitchen. He looked back at her, smiled, and invited her to sit beside him. Unable to resist, she did so. As she took a seat next to Timothy, her mother came in, and offered her slices of bread and soup, and she joined her cousin in the feast, all the while keeping a careful eye on him, wondering whether perhaps he was some kind of spectral spirit of some sort. She knew little of supernatural matters, you see. As they finished eating, Timothy turned to her, and he said something. Something that she was not expecting. Timothy said, "Margaret, where's the duck?" His gaze fixed on her, and she asked him to clarify what he had just said. He responded with, "I said, what rotten luck, Margaret, the weather was so terrible while you were out." But she knew that was not what she had heard the first time. Something terrible was happening, she could feel it in her bones. Every nerve in her body began to tremble. Her fingers broke out in goosebumps, her arms, her legs, her buttocks. She was quite terrified of what she had unleashed on this world. That night, Timothy stayed over. She was forced to sleep in the spare room so Timothy could have hers. The bed was bigger, you see. He was slightly taller than she. The bed would have been far too small for him in the spare room. Not appropriately sized at all, even though he was a relatively small boy. Not as small as Margaret. She was very small, you see. Very small little girl. Very small indeed. As she settled down in the spare room, her eyes fixated on the ceiling, she couldn't close them, you see. She was petrified of what she had perhaps unleashed. A couple of hours passed, and eventually she did fall asleep, until she woke with a start, with a faint tapping sound on the window. She looked over. There was nothing there. She closed her eyes again, and the tapping started up once more. She was petrified. She looked over again, and she saw a shadowy figure moving away from the window. She was on the second floor. She doubted it was a human. Perhaps a bird of some kind. Perhaps. She visited her mother in the night, and asked if she could sleep in her bed. It was safer, you see. She had been a little bit panicked. She explained to her mother that she'd been spooked by the weather, when in reality, we know the basis of her fear was far more troubling. Her mother was not aware of the full extent of it, you see. She told her to go away and sleep in the spare room like a good little girl should. Children shouldn't sleep with their parents, you see. Not when they're all grown up. Maybe when they're babies, but she was far from a baby, as was Timothy. He was not a baby at all. Neither was Margaret. Not babies in the slightest. She made her way grudgingly back to the spare room, and as soon as her head hit the pillow, she heard the tapping sound again. Tapping away at the window. She opened her eyes. She looked over. This time, the figure did not move away in time. She caught a glimpse of a duck. It stayed there for a few moments. It met her gaze. They stared into each other's eyes until it disappeared. Flew away, presumably. Margaret turned round to see her cousin Timothy standing in the doorway. He stared directly into her eyes, almost into her soul. His stare was so piercing, she could feel it, tearing away at her. She looked back to the window. The doc was not there. She looked back to the door. Timothy was no longer there. She was truly terrified, and she hid under her covers until morning. When she woke, the rest of the night went undisturbed, as it happens. She made her way down the stairs. Her parents were gathered round the television. All three of them. Unconventional family, you see. She saw that they were watching the news. The headline read, "All ducks dead." She was truly terrified now. She stuck around to hear the full extent of the damage she had unleashed. The news reporter claimed that every single duck in the world had died overnight of a mysterious ailment only affecting ducks. She knew it was her doing. She had brought Timothy back from the dead. She'd killed all the ducks. But what of the duck at the window? Were they perhaps out to get her in some kind of ghoulish vengeance? She knew not. But she was concerned. She decided there was only one thing she could do to put this right. She must have things back the way they were. She must kill Timothy the same way he had died previously. He'd been killed in a terrible accident. A car carrying a chainsaw-wielding midget had sped past him. The midget was too short for the seat. There was no child booster seat. He'd flown out the window clutching his active chainsaw, and it had sliced Timothy's head clean off. To reenact this deed, Margaret would have her work cut out for her. But she did her best. She rounded up a local midget. He was homeless, you see, and he was quite happy to go with her. Somewhat inebriated. She found herself a chainsaw and handed it to him. She pointed him in the direction of Cousin Timothy's bedroom after smuggling the midget with the chainsaw into the house. And she told him, "Cut off his head and everything will be back to normal." The midget did not think twice. He pushed open the door, wielded the chainsaw like a maniac, and began swinging. Margaret shut the door after he had entered, listening for the sound of decapitation, but she didn't hear it. She heard the chainsaw cutting into walls, bedposts, teddy bears, but not human necks. She gently pushed open the door after the noise died down, and she saw the midget decapitated in the middle of the floor, Timothy standing over him with the chainsaw, staring a hole in Margaret. She began to run. She made it to the front door until she felt the cold steel of the chainsaw penetrating her spinal cord. Timothy had caught up with her, you see. Stabbed her in the back with a chainsaw. She was quite dead. As she lay there, twitching, a duck landed beside her. The same duck that she had cursed the previous day. It quacked in her face, repeatedly, and then it turned to look at Timothy. He had disappeared. The duck didn't know what to make of it. The chainsaw was still running. The duck seemed to be somewhat confused, and it fell into the chainsaw and decapitated itself. You see, strange things happen not only to people, to animals also. Decapitation does not discriminate based on race, species, gender. It will find all and deal out swift vengeance if you're not careful. Goodbye. Try not to curse any ducks on your way to the cemetery to visit your recently decapitated cousin. Won't you?